The thermometer read 42 degrees below zero. When Nathaniel Kern heard the gunshots half a mile away, 3 desperate cracks echoing across the frozen valley, where another trapper was dying in his cabin despite a roaring fire. Inside his own shelter, Nathaniel sat comfortable in shirt sleeves, his small fire barely more than coals, warm air circulating evenly through a space that shouldn't have been possible to heat with so little fuel. Before we continue, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and if frontier survival stories fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's tale might just save your life in ways you never imagined. The winter of 1842 descended on the Montana Rockies with a brutality that old-timers would talk about for decades. Nathaniel Kern woke on the morning of January 14th to find frost patterns on the inside of his leather gloves, frozen solid despite hanging near his fire. Outside, the world had transformed into something alien and hostile. Trees exploded with sounds like rifle shots as sap froze and expanded inside their trunks. The snow had that peculiar squeak underfoot that only came when temperatures dropped into ranges where human survival became a mathematical problem rather than a certainty. Nathaniel was 31 years old that winter, though the mountains had weathered him beyond his years. He had come west 7 years earlier from Pennsylvania, drawn like so many others by the promise of fortune in beaver pelts and the intoxicating freedom of a life beyond civilization's reach. He had learned the trapping trade through hard experience, survived encounters with grizzlies and hostile war parties, and developed the careful competence that separated survivors from casualties in the unforgiving wilderness. He shared a cabin that winter with William Thatcher, a Massachusetts man 5 years his senior who had trapped the Yellowstone tributaries since 1836. Their partnership was one of mutual respect rather than friendship. Both men valued silence, competence, and the kind of reliability that meant the difference between life and death when things went wrong. They had built their cabin the previous summer using the standard methods every mountain man knew. Notched logs at the corners, mud and moss chinked between gaps, a single door facing east, one small window covered with oiled rawhide, and a simple stone fireplace that drew adequately when the wind cooperated. The cabin measured roughly 12 feet by 16 feet, dimensions considered generous for a 2-man trapping camp. It had taken them 5 days to construct, which was about average. The logs were pine, readily available, and straight enough for basic construction. They had followed the same design that trappers had used for generations, the accumulated wisdom of frontier building distilled into a structure that was quick to erect and serviceable for its purpose. But on that January morning, with temperatures plunging to levels that made exposed skin freeze in minutes, Nathaniel began to notice something that would eventually obsess him. Despite the fire William had built up before dawn, despite the flames consuming split pine at a rate that would exhaust their wood supply weeks before spring, the cabin remained cold. Not freezing, but cold enough that their water bucket had ice on its surface. Cold enough that breath hung visible in the air. Cold enough that both men kept their heavy coats on throughout the day. Nathaniel stood near the fire, trying to warm his hands, and realized he could feel a draft coming from the corner nearest the door. He moved closer and held his hand near the notched joint where 2 logs met. Cold air flowed through the gap steadily, a river of heat loss that the fire could never overcome. Nathaniel Kern and William Thatcher had established their partnership in the spring of 1841, brought together by mutual acquaintances at the summer rendezvous near the Green River. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was entering its twilight years by then, though few trappers acknowledged the inevitable decline. Beaver populations had been trapped heavily for 2 decades, and fashion trends back east were shifting away from felt hats toward silk. But men still ventured into the wilderness, chasing the dream of one more profitable season. The partnership made practical sense. 2 men could cover more trap lines, provide security against theft or attack, and share the substantial labor of wilderness survival. Nathaniel brought youth and physical strength to the arrangement. William contributed experience and an encyclopedic knowledge of beaver behavior accumulated over 6 seasons in the mountains. They agreed to split profits evenly and selected their territory carefully, choosing a remote valley in what would later become southwestern Montana, far enough from established routes to avoid competition. Their first season together proved moderately successful. They trapped 43 beaver, along with assorted marten, fox, and one exceptional wolf pelt that William predicted would bring premium price. The work was brutally hard, starting before dawn and ending after dark throughout the fall trapping season. They waded through icy streams, reset traps in freezing water, skinned animals with numb fingers, and stretched pelts on willow frames during evening hours by firelight. But the work was familiar, and both men accepted hardship as the cost of independence. They were free from factory bosses, landlords, and the suffocating social hierarchies of eastern cities. They answered to no one, lived by their own skills, and prospered or failed based entirely on their own efforts. For men of a certain temperament, this freedom justified any amount of physical suffering. The cabin they built in July of 1841 followed patterns both men had learned from other trappers. Select a site near water but above. Flood level. Cut logs of roughly uniform diameter. Notch the ends so they interlocked at corners. Stack them to desired height. Fill gaps with moss and mud. Install a door and perhaps a window. Build a fireplace if stones were available, and cover the whole structure with a roof of poles and bark. The entire process was well established, passed down through informal apprenticeship from experienced mountain men to newcomers. Neither Nathaniel nor William questioned these methods. They worked adequately, and innovation seemed unnecessary. Hundreds of trappers lived in similar cabins scattered throughout the Rockies, from the Sangre de Cristos to the Canadian territories. The design was proven, functional, and required only basic carpentry skills and an axe. Their second season together began in late October of 1842 with trap lines established along 3 different creek systems within a day's travel of their cabin. The beaver population in their territory remained healthy, and early catches suggested another profitable year. Both men felt confident heading into winter. They had adequate supplies, good equipment, and a solid shelter. Everything seemed routine until the temperature began its catastrophic descent in early January. William Thatcher died on November 23, 1842, though the exact moment of his death remained uncertain. Nathaniel had been checking their northern trap line, a circuit that required leaving camp before dawn and returning after dark. William had stayed at the cabin that day, complaining of a persistent cough that had troubled him for nearly a week. The decision seemed prudent at the time. Rest, warmth, and recovery made more sense than forcing a sick man into the wilderness during increasingly cold weather. The storm arrived around midday with shocking speed. Clear skies gave way to heavy clouds within an hour, and snow began falling in thick, wind-driven sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards. Temperature plunged as the storm intensified, dropping from tolerably cold to dangerously frigid in the span of a few hours. Nathaniel, caught miles from the cabin, fought his way back through deepening snow and gathering darkness, following familiar landmarks more by memory than sight. He reached the cabin well after full dark, exhausted and half frozen, despite his heavy clothing and constant movement. Smoke rose from the chimney, a reassuring sign that William had maintained the fire. But when Nathaniel pushed open the door, he found his partner lying motionless on the sleeping platform, wrapped in both their blankets, eyes closed and skin pale with a bluish tint that told the story before Nathaniel even touched him. William had frozen to death inside the cabin. The fire still burned in the fireplace, flames consuming the last pieces of split wood William had fed it before losing consciousness. But the heat had not been enough. Nathaniel checked the wood supply and found it substantially depleted. William had clearly tried to combat the cold by building up the fire, burning through wood at an unsustainable rate in a desperate attempt to raise the interior temperature. It had not worked. The cabin's design defeated his efforts. Heat rose and escaped through gaps in the roof. Cold air flowed steadily through spaces between logs, through the poorly fitted door, through every joint and corner where construction left openings. The flat walls caught wind pressure, driving cold air through any available crack. The corners, where two flat surfaces met at 90-degree angles, became pockets where cold air pooled and circulated, creating zones that remained frigid regardless of fire intensity. Nathaniel spent that night sleepless beside William's body, keeping the fire built up and trying to understand what had happened. His partner had not been incapacitated. The remaining wood supply proved William had been conscious and active enough to feed the fire repeatedly. He had not frozen from neglect or inability. He had frozen despite his best efforts, defeated by a structure that could not retain heat against extreme cold and wind. The realization settled over Nathaniel with crushing weight. The cabin was inadequate, not poorly built by the standards of frontier construction, but fundamentally flawed in its basic design. And every other trapper in the mountains lived in essentially identical structures. Nathaniel buried William 3 days later on a hillside overlooking the valley where they had trapped together. The ground was frozen solid, forcing him to build a fire over the burial site and let it burn for hours before the earth softened enough to excavate. He worked methodically, saying nothing, feeling nothing, except a growing determination that William's death needed to mean something beyond random tragedy. He marked the grave with stones arranged in a cairn that would survive weather and seasons, then returned to the cabin alone. The structure that had seemed adequate weeks earlier now appeared as what it truly was, a temporary shelter that provided minimal protection against moderate conditions but failed catastrophically when confronted with genuine extremes. Nathaniel began examining every aspect of its construction with the intensity of a man looking for answers that meant survival. The corners revealed the most obvious flaws. Where logs notched together at 90-degree angles, gaps opened despite careful initial fitting. Wood dried and contracted, mud chinking cracked and fell away, and cold air poured through the spaces with relentless efficiency. Nathaniel held his hand near each corner in turn and felt distinct drafts, rivers of frigid air flowing into the cabin's interior. These corner zones remained cold, regardless of fire size, creating temperature gradients where the center of the cabin might reach tolerable warmth, while the perimeter stayed dangerously frigid. The flat walls presented different problems. When wind struck the cabin's exterior, it found purchase on the broad, flat log surfaces, creating pressure that drove cold air through any available opening. The rectangular shape acted like a sail in some wind directions, catching and channeling air currents rather than deflecting them. During storms, Nathaniel could actually feel the walls flexing slightly under wind pressure, opening microscopic gaps that became passages for heat loss. The door and window, necessary features for any habitable structure, represented massive weak points. Both penetrated the wall system completely, creating openings that could never be sealed as thoroughly as solid log surfaces. The door fit loosely in its frame by necessity, requiring clearance to open and close. The window, covered with oiled raw hide stretched over a wooden frame, allowed light but provided minimal insulation. Together, these openings accounted for disproportionate heat loss relative to their size. Nathaniel spent weeks that winter analyzing the cabin's thermal behavior with obsessive attention. He noted that heat rose and collected near the roof peak, exactly where it did the least good for inhabitants living at floor level. He observed that the rectangular floor plan created maximum wall surface area relative to interior space, meaning maximum opportunity for heat to escape. He recognized that the standard cabin design prioritized ease of construction over thermal efficiency, a reasonable trade-off in moderate climates, but potentially fatal in extreme conditions. Other mountain men would have accepted these limitations, attributed William's death to bad luck or insufficient firewood, and moved on. But Nathaniel possessed a mind that could not leave problems unsolved. Nathaniel spent the remainder of that winter documenting how rectangular cabins failed under extreme conditions. He could no longer trap effectively with William gone, so he used his time differently. He visited other trappers scattered throughout the surrounding valleys, offering to help with chores or share meals, observing their shelters with analytical intensity that surprised men accustomed to simple survival rather than systematic study. Every cabin told the same story. Frost accumulated on interior walls near corners where cold air pooled and circulated despite roaring fires. Ice formed around door frames where drafts flowed constantly. Men burned through enormous quantities of firewood, trying to maintain barely survivable temperatures, exhausting supplies that should have lasted entire winters. Several trappers showed Nathaniel frostbitten fingers or toes sustained inside their own cabins, injuries that should have been impossible in sheltered spaces with active fires. A trapper named Hosea Grant had hung blankets across his cabin interior, creating a smaller insulated space around his fireplace. The technique helped marginally, but reduced his living space to an area barely large enough to lie down. Another man, Swedish immigrant, named Anders Lindqvist, had packed snow against his exterior walls for additional insulation. The snow helped somewhat, but melted during warmer days and refroze into ice that conducted cold even more efficiently than air. These improvised solutions revealed that other men recognized the problem, but none had addressed the fundamental design flaws. They treated symptoms rather than causes, adding insulation to structures that were geometrically inefficient regardless of material thickness. Nathaniel began to understand that the problem was not construction quality, but shape itself. The rectangular form, with its corners and flat walls, was inherently inferior for heat retention. He started sketching alternatives in a leather-bound journal he had purchased years earlier but never used. He drew cabins with rounded corners, cabins with octagonal plans, cabins with double-wall construction. Each design attempted to address specific thermal problems he had identified, but drawing solutions and building them were entirely different challenges, and Nathaniel lacked the technical knowledge to translate concepts into practical construction methods. The mathematics troubled him particularly. He understood intuitively that circular shapes minimize surface area relative to interior volume, but he could not calculate exact ratios or determine optimal dimensions. He knew that eliminating corners would reduce cold air pockets, but he had no idea how to build curved walls using straight logs. The tools and techniques required for unconventional construction remained mysterious to him. As winter released its grip and spring arrived in late March of 1843, Nathaniel made a decision. He would travel to St. Louis with his modest catch of pelts, sell them for whatever price he could obtain, and spend time in civilization studying buildings. Other trappers used town visits for drinking, gambling, and temporary relationships with women who tolerated mountain men for their money. Nathaniel would use his time differently. He would learn how structures were actually engineered by people who understood principles rather than simply following tradition. Nathaniel departed the mountains in early April of 1843, traveling alone on horseback with his winter's catch packed on 2 mules. The journey to St. Louis required nearly a month, following established trails through mountain passes still choked with snow, across endless prairie where spring grass was just beginning to emerge, and finally into increasingly settled country where farms and small towns appeared with growing frequency. He sold his pelts to a trading house on the St. Louis riverfront for less than he had hoped, but enough to fund an extended stay. Most trappers lodged in cheap boarding houses near the docks, spending their money quickly on entertainment and supplies before heading back to the mountains. Nathaniel took a small room in a quieter neighborhood 3 blocks from the river and set about his real purpose with methodical determination. St. Louis in 1843 was a city transforming itself from frontier trading post to substantial urban center. Buildings of brick and stone were replacing earlier wooden structures. Warehouses, churches, commercial blocks, and private homes demonstrated construction techniques far beyond anything Nathaniel had experienced. He began walking the streets daily, observing everything, sketching buildings that interested him, and occasionally approaching workmen with questions. The circular structures fascinated him most intensely. He found a grain silo under construction near the river docks and spent 3 days watching the crew work. The builders created the curved walls using brick laid in gradually curving courses, each brick angled slightly relative to its neighbors. The foreman, a German immigrant named Heinrich Schmidt, explained the geometry involved. A circle encloses maximum space with minimum wall material. The curved surface distributes weight evenly around the circumference. Wind pressure slides around the curve rather than pushing against flat surfaces. Nathaniel watched how they built the silo's foundation, establishing a perfect circle using a central stake and measured radius. He observed how they calculated the number of bricks needed for each course as the diameter increased toward the top. He studied how they incorporated doorways into the circular wall without compromising structural integrity. Heinrich, curious about why a mountain man cared about masonry techniques, allowed Nathaniel to examine the working drawings and even explained some of the mathematical principles involved. Other circular structures revealed additional lessons. A water tower used wooden staves bound with iron hoops, creating a watertight cylinder through tension rather than sealing individual joints. A church tower demonstrated how circular forms could support substantial weight overhead through even distribution around the perimeter. An industrial furnace showed how curved surfaces reflected heat inward rather than allowing it to escape through corners. Nathaniel spent 2 weeks studying these buildings, filling his journal with sketches, measurements, and notes. He began to understand that building a round cabin was theoretically possible but would require techniques significantly different from standard log construction. The logs themselves were straight, not curved, which meant he would need to approximate a circle using many straight segments, angling each log relative to its neighbors to create the curved wall. The challenge seemed enormous, but no longer impossible. Nathaniel spent his final week in St. Louis working through the practical problems of circular cabin construction. He purchased paper, pencils, a compass for drawing circles, and a basic mathematics primer from a bookshop that catered to engineers and surveyors. In his boarding house room each evening, he sketched variations of round cabin designs, trying to determine how many log segments would be needed to approximate a smooth circle and how to join them structurally. The fundamental insight came while watching children play with wooden blocks in a park near his lodging. A boy was building a circular fort using rectangular blocks, arranging them in a ring with small gaps between each block. The structure was crude but recognizably round, despite being constructed from straight pieces. Nathaniel realized he had been overcomplicating the problem. He did not need to bend logs or cut complex curves. He simply needed to cut straight logs to specific lengths and stack them in circular courses with each log angled slightly inward. He began calculating dimensions. A cabin with interior diameter of 12 feet would provide roughly the same floor space as a rectangular cabin measuring 10 feet by 14 feet, but with significantly less wall surface area. The circular perimeter would be approximately 38 feet compared to 48 feet for the rectangular equivalent. That 10-foot difference represented substantial reduction in heat loss surface. Additionally, the elimination of corners would prevent cold air pockets entirely. The door presented the first major technical challenge. A circular wall had no flat surface against which to mount a standard rectangular door frame. Nathaniel sketched various solutions before settling on a design that incorporated the door opening into the circular form. He would create a slightly flattened section of the circle where the door would mount, using longer logs in that area to approximate a short, straight wall segment. The compromise would barely affect the overall thermal efficiency while making door installation feasible. The roof required even more careful consideration. A conical roof would distribute weight evenly around the circular wall and shed snow effectively. But creating proper cone geometry using straight poles and planks demanded precise angle calculations. Nathaniel worked through the mathematics slowly, consulting his primer repeatedly. A cone with 12-foot base diameter and 6-foot peak height would create appropriate pitch for snow shedding while keeping the overall structure low enough to minimize wind exposure. The window could be small and positioned high on the wall, reducing heat loss while still providing necessary light and ventilation. The fireplace would sit at the exact center of the circular floor plan, equidistant from all walls, radiating heat uniformly in all directions. Every element of the design served multiple purposes: structural strength, thermal efficiency, and weather protection integrated into a unified system. Other trappers would consider this design eccentric, possibly insane. Building a round cabin would require substantially more planning, more careful measurement, and more construction time than standard rectangular methods. But Nathaniel had watched William freeze to death in a standard cabin. He had felt the drafts pouring through corners. He had calculated the excessive wall surface area that rectangular designs created. The circular solution was not eccentric. It was thermally superior in ways that would mean the difference between survival and death during extreme cold. Nathaniel returned to the mountains in early June of 1843, his mules loaded with supplies that confused the trading post clerk who filled his order. Instead of standard trapper goods, Nathaniel purchased specialized tools: a large compass for marking circular layouts, multiple levels for ensuring consistent angles, dozens of wooden stakes for establishing foundation geometry, heavy rope for measuring and marking, and a mathematics book that most mountain men would have considered completely useless. He also brought detailed plans drawn on heavy paper, showing circular cabin layouts from multiple views, roof geometry calculations, and construction sequence steps. The clerk asked if Nathaniel was planning to build a church in the wilderness. Nathaniel did not bother explaining. He paid for his goods and started the long journey back to his territory. The trip took 3 weeks, traveling through early summer weather that made mountain passage feasible but still challenging. Nathaniel encountered several trappers heading toward civilization with their spring catches, men he had known casually from previous seasons. They camped together one evening, and Nathaniel showed them his plans during conversation around the fire. The response was unanimous mockery. A round cabin made no sense. How would you notch round corners that did not exist? How would you stack logs without straight walls to guide alignment? Why waste time on complex geometry when standard methods worked adequately? One trapper, a Kentucky man named Silas Crawford, suggested that Nathaniel had spent too much time alone after William's death and should consider finding a new partner, or leaving the mountains entirely before isolation drove him completely mad. Nathaniel listened without argument. He understood their skepticism. These men built cabins the way their fathers and grandfathers had built them, following patterns passed down through generations. Suggesting that those patterns were fundamentally flawed challenged not just construction methods, but entire traditions of frontier competence. They heard his proposal as criticism of their own skills and judgment, but Nathaniel had watched William die. He had felt the cold air pouring through corners. He had studied buildings designed by men who understood geometry and thermal dynamics. He knew what he was proposing was not madness, but engineering applied to frontier conditions. Their mockery did not shake his determination. If anything, it strengthened his resolve to prove that better methods were possible. He reached his territory in late June and immediately began scouting for the ideal building site. He would not rebuild where the old cabin stood. That location, chosen for convenience when he and William were focused on trapping rather than survival, was not optimal for what he now planned to construct. He needed a site that would maximize his circular cabin's advantages while minimizing environmental challenges. After 4 days of careful evaluation, he selected a spot on a slight rise about half a mile from the creek where they had trapped. The location offered excellent drainage, clear sightlines in all directions, and protection from prevailing winds behind a natural rock outcropping. Nathaniel spent the first week of July preparing his building site with care that would have seemed excessive to other trappers. Most mountain men cleared minimal ground, leveled nothing, and began stacking logs directly on earth. Nathaniel approached foundation work as though building a permanent structure rather than temporary wilderness shelter, because he understood that everything built above ground depended on what lay beneath. He began by marking the exact circle where his cabin would stand. Using a wooden stake driven into the center point and a rope measured to 6 feet, he walked the circumference, marking it with smaller stakes every 3 feet. The resulting ring of stakes defined his cabin's exterior wall line with precision that looked obsessive but was actually essential. Building a circular structure required knowing exactly where the curve should be at every point, because even small deviations would compound into major structural problems as walls rose. Next, he excavated a shallow trench following the circular line, removing topsoil and organic matter down to mineral earth. The trench measured 8 inches deep and 12 inches wide, following the stake line perfectly. Other trappers would have considered this wasted effort, but Nathaniel had learned from watching St. Louis builders that foundations prevented settling and moisture damage that destroyed structures over time. He filled the trench with stones gathered from the nearby creek, selecting flat rocks that could be fitted tightly together. The work was backbreaking, requiring him to haul hundreds of pounds of stone from the creek to his building site. Each stone needed to be positioned carefully, larger ones at the bottom for stability, smaller ones filling gaps. He used smaller rocks and gravel to fill every space, creating a solid stone ring that would support the cabin's weight and prevent ground moisture from wicking into the logs. The stone foundation took 9 days to complete, far longer than the entire construction time most trappers devoted to their cabins. But when finished, Nathaniel had a perfectly circular, level, well-drained foundation that would support his unconventional structure. He checked the circle's geometry repeatedly, using his rope and stakes, confirming that the diameter measured exactly 12 feet at multiple points. He then addressed drainage. Around the foundation, Montana weather could produce torrential rains that turned level ground into temporary ponds. Water pooling around a cabin's base would rot logs and undermine foundations. Nathaniel dug a shallow drainage channel around the exterior of his stone ring, directing water away from the structure toward a natural low point 20 feet distant. The channel was subtle, barely noticeable to casual observation, but would prevent water from ever collecting against his cabin walls. Finally, he prepared his building materials. He spent 2 weeks cutting and hauling logs from a pine grove a quarter-mile away. But unlike standard cabin construction, where trappers used whatever trees were convenient, Nathaniel selected each log with obsessive care. He wanted logs of nearly identical diameter, approximately 10 inches thick, and as straight as possible. He rejected trees with excessive taper, significant curves, or irregular shapes. When he finished, he had 73 logs stacked near his foundation, every one meeting his specifications. Building circular walls from straight logs required solving a problem that no trapper Nathaniel knew had ever attempted. Standard notched corners worked because logs met at 90-degree angles, allowing simple overlapping joints. A circular wall had no corners, only continuous curve, which meant each log needed to be positioned at a slight angle relative to its neighbors. The challenge was determining exactly how much angle and how to secure the logs without notches. Nathaniel began with careful geometry. He had calculated that using logs cut to 4-foot lengths would create a circle composed of approximately 30 segments per course. Each log would need to angle inward at about 12 degrees relative to the previous log to maintain the curve. He marked these angles on his foundation, using stakes and measured lines to establish where each log should begin and end. The first course of logs went down slowly. He positioned each 4-foot log on the stone foundation, angling it precisely according to his marks. Where one log ended, the next began, overlapping by about 6 inches. This overlap was critical because it would allow him to pin the logs together vertically through multiple courses. He used his level constantly, ensuring each log sat perfectly horizontal despite the angle relative to its neighbor. Securing the logs without traditional notching required innovation. Nathaniel had brought an auger, a tool for drilling holes through wood, purchased specifically for this purpose. Once he had positioned 3 logs in the first course, he drilled vertical holes through all 3 where they overlapped, creating channels that penetrated multiple logs simultaneously. Into these holes, he drove wooden pins he had whittled from hardwood, each pin 16 inches long and 1 inch in diameter. The pins locked the logs together vertically, preventing them from shifting or separating. The system worked, but required extraordinary precision. Every log needed to be positioned at the correct angle and height before drilling. A misaligned hole would create structural weakness. Nathaniel worked methodically, positioning logs, checking angles and levels multiple times, then drilling and pinning. The first course took 3 full days to complete. A rectangular cabin's first course would have taken half a day. The second course followed the same pattern, but with each log positioned directly above the gap between 2 logs below, similar to bricklaying. This offset pattern distributed stress and prevented vertical seams that could become weak points. He continued drilling vertical pins through multiple courses simultaneously, some pins penetrating 3 or 4 logs at once, creating a rigid structure that could not be disassembled without destroying it. As the walls rose, the circular shape became increasingly apparent. By the 5th course, the cabin's curve was unmistakable, a cylinder rising from the foundation with no corners anywhere. Nathaniel could walk around the interior and see the same distance to the wall in every direction, the space feeling fundamentally different from rectangular rooms. The construction was slow, methodical, and demanded constant attention to geometry. After 4 weeks, he had completed 8 courses, bringing the walls to approximately shoulder height. The structure already demonstrated properties that rectangular cabins lacked. Wind flowed around the curve rather than pushing against flat surfaces. There were no corners where drafts could penetrate or cold air could collect. The doorway presented the first major structural challenge. Nathaniel needed an opening large enough to enter while maintaining the circular wall's integrity. He had planned for this by incorporating a slightly flattened section into his circle, using longer logs in that area to create a short, straight segment approximately 3 feet wide. This compromise barely affected the overall geometry while providing a flat surface against which to mount a door frame. He cut the door opening by carefully sawing through logs at the appropriate height, creating a rectangular aperture in the otherwise circular wall. The cut ends needed reinforcement to prevent the logs from shifting. Nathaniel fashioned a door frame from thick planks, mortising them into the logs above, below, and beside the opening. The frame locked into the log structure, distributing weight around the opening and preventing stress concentration. The door itself was built from vertical planks cut from a single large pine, fitted tightly edge to edge, and reinforced with horizontal cross pieces. He hung it on iron hinges he had brought from St. Louis, massive hardware strong enough to support the door's substantial weight. The hinges mounted to the frame with bolts that penetrated completely through the frame and into the logs behind, creating connections that could not be torn loose. Inside, he installed a heavy wooden bar that dropped into brackets mounted to the wall on either side of the door. When engaged, the bar prevented the door from being opened from outside, transforming it into part of the wall structure. The bar system was simple but effective, requiring no complex locks or mechanisms. The window required similar problem-solving. Nathaniel positioned it high on the wall, about 5 feet above the interior floor, facing south to maximize light. The opening was small, only 12 inches square, minimizing heat loss while providing adequate illumination and ventilation. He created a shutter from thick planks reinforced with crosspieces hinged on the interior so it could be secured closed during storms or cold weather. Behind the shutter, he installed a panel made from scraped hide stretched over a wooden frame, similar to rawhide windows in standard cabins, but smaller and better sealed. The hide allowed diffused light to enter while blocking wind. The small size meant heat loss through the window would be minimal compared to larger openings in rectangular cabins. Chinking the gaps between logs in a circular wall required adapting standard techniques to curved surfaces. Nathaniel mixed clay from the creek bank with dried grass and small amounts of pine resin he had collected and boiled down. The mixture was more sophisticated than typical mud chinking, designed to remain flexible as wood expanded and contracted with temperature and humidity changes. He packed the chinking mixture between logs from the interior, pressing it firmly into gaps and smoothing it flush with the log surfaces. The work was tedious, requiring him to work his way around the entire circle repeatedly as he completed each course. But proper chinking was essential for thermal efficiency. Every gap sealed was heat retained. By mid-August, the walls stood complete at 10 courses high, approximately 7 feet from floor to the top of the wall. The circular structure rose from its foundation like a tower, solid and seamless, unlike anything else in the surrounding wilderness. With the walls complete, Nathaniel focused on refining the critical elements that would determine his cabin's functionality and thermal performance. The door, though installed, required weatherproofing that would prevent air infiltration around its edges. Standard cabin doors hung loosely in their frames, allowing visible gaps that let cold air pour through. Nathaniel was determined to eliminate every possible path for heat loss. He cut thin strips of leather from a deer hide and tacked them around the door frame's interior edges, creating a seal that would compress when the door closed. The leather strips overlapped the door's edges by half an inch, ensuring contact even if the wood swelled or shrank with moisture changes. When the door closed, the leather compressed against it, blocking drafts effectively. He tested the seal by closing the door and holding his hand near the edges, feeling for air movement. Where he detected even minor drafts, he added additional leather, or adjusted the strips until no airflow was detectable. The exterior side of the door received different treatment. Nathaniel covered it with an additional layer of split planks arranged vertically, creating a double thickness that provided extra insulation and weather protection. The outer planks were attached with wooden pegs driven through into the door's main structure, creating an assembly that was both thermally efficient and extremely sturdy. The finished door weighed nearly 80 pounds, but moved smoothly on its heavy hinges. The window required similar attention to detail. The shutters needed to seal tightly when closed, transforming the window from an opening into an insulated wall section. Nathaniel carved the shutter edges and frame with care, creating overlapping surfaces that pressed together when the shutters closed. He added leather strips similar to those on the door, ensuring an airtight seal. The hide panel behind the shutters was scraped thin enough to transmit light, but thick enough to provide some insulation value. He stretched it tightly over its frame and secured it with hide strips wrapped around the frame's edges. The result was translucent rather than transparent, allowing diffused light to enter while blocking direct wind and reducing heat loss. When the shutters closed, the window became nearly as thermally efficient as the solid wall surrounding it. When opened, it provided light and ventilation without creating excessive heat loss due to its small size. Nathaniel had observed that rectangular cabins often featured relatively large windows that provided good light but represented massive thermal weak points. His 12-inch square window provided adequate light while minimizing the compromise in thermal performance. He also addressed the transition between the stone foundation and the first course of logs. Moisture from ground contact could cause the logs to rot over time. Nathaniel packed the gap between stone and wood with moss mixed with pine tar, creating a seal that was both waterproof and flexible. The tar prevented moisture wicking, while the moss accommodated the slight movements that occurred as the structure settled. Every detail received this level of attention. Nathaniel understood that thermal efficiency came from eliminating all the small leaks and weak points that collectively caused major heat loss. A perfectly circular design would fail if poorly executed. But a circular design executed with obsessive attention to sealing and insulation would demonstrate performance that rectangular cabins could never match. The roof represented the final and perhaps most critical structural challenge. A flat or gently sloped roof would accumulate snow to dangerous weights during winter storms. A steeply pitched roof would shed snow effectively but create complex geometry where it met the circular walls. Nathaniel needed a conical design that would distribute weight evenly around the circular perimeter while providing adequate pitch for snow to slide off naturally. He began by constructing a central support pole, a single large pine log set vertically at the exact center of the cabin's floor. The pole measured 8 inches in diameter and extended from floor to 7 feet above the wall tops. This center pole would support the roof's peak, while the circular walls supported its perimeter, distributing weight evenly around the entire structure rather than concentrating it at corners as rectangular cabins did. From the center pole's top to the wall's edge measured approximately 6 feet horizontally. Nathaniel needed rafters that would span this distance while creating proper cone angle. He cut 24 rafters from straight pine saplings, each measuring 7 feet long and 4 inches in diameter. The rafters would extend from the center pole to slightly beyond the wall tops, creating an overhang that would protect the walls from rain and snow melt. Installing the rafters required precise spacing. 24 rafters around a circular perimeter meant each rafter would be approximately 5 feet from its neighbors at the wall edge. Nathaniel marked these positions on the top log course, ensuring even distribution. He notched each rafter at both ends, creating a seat where it would rest on the center pole and another where it would sit on the wall logs. He raised each rafter individually, positioning the upper end against the center pole and the lower end on the wall top. The rafters radiated from the center like wheel spokes, creating the conical frame. He secured them to the center pole using rawhide lashing, wrapping each connection tightly, and pinned them to the wall logs using wooden pegs driven vertically through rafter and log. With the rafter framework complete, Nathaniel began covering it with layers that would create a waterproof, insulated roof. The first layer consisted of thin poles laid perpendicular to the rafters, spaced every 6 inches from peak to eave. These poles created a framework to support subsequent layers. Over the poles, he laid strips of bark from dead pine trees, overlapping them like shingles with each strip covering the gaps in the layer below. The bark layer provided initial weather protection, but Nathaniel added more. Over the bark, he spread a thick layer of clay mixed with grass, pressing it into all gaps and smoothing it to encourage water runoff. The clay layer dried over several days, creating a semi-rigid shell. Finally, he covered everything with sod cut from a nearby meadow, living grass and roots that would continue growing, creating a living roof that was waterproof, insulated, and would improve over time as the grass established itself. The completed roof was heavy, probably 700 pounds of material resting on the structure. But the circular walls and center pole distributed this weight so evenly that no single point experienced excessive stress. The conical shape meant snow would slide off rather than accumulating, and the multiple layers created exceptional insulation value. With the structure weather-tight, Nathaniel turned his attention to the interior layout, approaching it as an integrated thermal system rather than simply arranging furniture. Every element would be positioned to maximize heat retention and distribution. The circular floor plan created unique opportunities that rectangular cabins could not match, primarily the ability to position a heat source at the geometric center, equidistant from all walls. He began by constructing the fireplace at the cabin's exact center, directly beneath the center support pole. Most mountain men built fireplaces against exterior walls, creating uneven heat distribution where one side of the cabin remained warm while the opposite side stayed cold. Nathaniel's central fireplace would radiate heat equally in all directions, warming the entire circular space uniformly. The fireplace construction required skill and careful work. He gathered flat stones from the creek, selecting pieces that would fit together tightly without large gaps. The firebox measured 2 feet square and 18 inches deep, large enough to burn substantial logs, but not so large as to require excessive fuel. He built the walls from stones laid in clay mortar, creating a solid structure that would contain fire safely. The chimney presented unique challenges. It needed to extend up through the center support pole and roof peak, drawing smoke out while retaining as much heat as possible. Nathaniel built the chimney from stones mortared tightly together, creating a column that rose through a hole he had left in the center pole and continued up through the roof peak. The chimney was deliberately narrow, only 8 inches in diameter, forcing smoke to move slowly upward and transfer more heat to the surrounding stones before escaping. Around the fireplace, he left a circular, clear area about 4 feet in diameter. This space would allow him to tend the fire and cook from any side, taking advantage of the central position. Beyond this clear area, he began arranging his living space, working outward toward the walls. He built a sleeping platform along one section of the curved wall, raising it 18 inches off the floor. Elevated sleeping kept him away from the coldest air that would settle at floor level, and the space beneath provided storage for equipment and supplies. The platform followed the wall's curve, creating a sleeping area that wrapped partially around the cabin's circumference. Opposite the sleeping platform, he constructed shelving for food supplies and equipment. The shelves were mounted to the wall at various heights, taking advantage of the full vertical space. He built a small table that could be positioned anywhere in the cabin, lightweight enough to move, but sturdy enough for meal preparation and equipment. Maintenance. The circular layout created an efficiency that rectangular cabins lacked. Nathaniel could reach any area of the cabin with minimal movement. The central fireplace meant he was never more than 6 feet from the heat source, regardless of where he positioned himself. The curved walls created no awkward corners where space was wasted or difficult to use. Every square foot of floor area was equally accessible and functional. The first snow arrived on October 9, 1843, unusually early even for Montana mountain country. Nathaniel had completed his cabin 3 weeks earlier and spent the intervening time gathering firewood, processing meat from 2 elk he had killed, and preparing for the winter that would test everything he had built. He watched the clouds gather with anticipation rather than dread, knowing that extreme conditions would reveal whether his months of obsessive work had created genuine improvement or merely eccentric failure. The temperature dropped steadily through the day, and by evening, snow fell heavily. Nathaniel prepared a test fire in his central fireplace, using only modest amounts of wood, far less than he would have burned in his previous rectangular cabin. He lit the kindling and watched as flames caught and grew, smoke rising smoothly up the narrow chimney. Within 20 minutes, he noticed warmth spreading through the cabin evenly, reaching the walls in all directions simultaneously. He walked the interior perimeter, holding his hand near the walls at various points, feeling for cold spots or drafts. He found none. The temperature at the walls felt only slightly cooler than the temperature near the fireplace, a remarkable difference from rectangular cabins where corners remained frigid while central areas overheated. The circular design was working exactly as he had calculated it would. As the night progressed and outside temperature plunged, Nathaniel reduced his fire to a bed of coals. Using perhaps a quarter of the wood he would have burned in his previous shelter. The cabin remained comfortable. He removed his heavy coat and worked in shirt sleeves, repairing a trap that needed new springs. The air inside was warm and still, with no drafts cutting through, no cold zones near walls or floor. Around midnight, he heard wind rising outside, beginning to blow hard from the north. He listened for signs of air infiltration, the whistling drafts that plagued rectangular cabins during storms. The wind sound was audible but distant, deflected around the curved exterior walls rather than forcing its way through gaps. Inside, the air remained calm and warm. By morning, 8 inches of snow covered the ground and drifted against the cabin's base. Nathaniel opened his door and was struck by the dramatic contrast between interior and exterior conditions. Outside, temperature was perhaps 15 degrees, wind still gusting, snow continuing to fall. Inside, the space was warm enough that condensation had formed on the small window's hide covering, clear evidence of the temperature differential his design had created. The real revelation came over the following weeks as winter established itself and temperatures dropped into truly dangerous ranges. During a cold snap in late October, when outside temperature reached 20 below zero, Nathaniel maintained comfortable interior conditions using only 2 small fires per day, morning and evening. The thermal mass of the thick log walls absorbed heat when the fire burned and released it slowly when the fire died down, creating stable temperatures that required minimal fuel input. He began keeping notes, documenting fuel consumption and interior temperatures using a thermometer he had purchased in St. Louis. The data was striking. He was burning approximately 1/3 the firewood that would have been required in his previous rectangular cabin, while maintaining superior comfort. Elijah Drummond was a Kentucky trapper who had worked the Montana Territory for 4 years, operating from a standard rectangular cabin about 5 miles from Nathaniel's location. He was competent, experienced, and well supplied for winter. But on the morning of January 7th, 1844, when temperature dropped to 48 degrees below zero and stayed there for 6 consecutive days, competence and supplies were not enough to save him from his cabin's fundamental design flaws. Nathaniel knew nothing of Elijah's crisis until the 4th day of the cold snap, when he noticed smoke from Elijah's direction had stopped rising. Trappers understood that smoke meant life and survival. No smoke during extreme cold meant something had gone wrong. Despite dangerous conditions, Nathaniel bundled himself in every layer he owned and made the difficult journey to Elijah's cabin, following familiar landmarks through snow and biting wind. He found Elijah's cabin in crisis. The door hung partially open, snow drifted inside the entrance, and no smoke came from the chimney. Nathaniel pushed through the door and found Elijah huddled in blankets near a dead fireplace, barely conscious. Fingers blackened with frostbite, speech slurred from hypothermia. The interior temperature was below freezing, despite walls and roof that should have provided shelter. The story emerged slowly. Elijah had burned through his entire indoor firewood supply trying to keep the cabin warm. He had broken up and burned his furniture, then started on structural elements, tearing boards from his sleeping platform and shelving. But no amount of fuel could overcome the cabin's thermal inefficiency. Heat poured out through corners, through gaps in the chinking, through the poorly fitted door and window. The rectangular design created cold zones where frost accumulated on interior walls, even with the fire roaring. Finally, Elijah had exhausted everything burnable and succumbed to cold, while surrounded by walls that could not protect him. Nathaniel got Elijah. Moving forced him to walk despite protests and confusion. He bundled him in blankets and half-carried, half-dragged him through the snow toward his own cabin. The journey took 3 hours, dangerous for both men but necessary. Leaving Elijah in his failed shelter meant certain death. They reached Nathaniel's round cabin in late afternoon. Nathaniel got Elijah inside, stripped off his frozen clothing, and wrapped him in dry blankets near the central fireplace. He built up the fire and prepared hot broth from dried meat. Over the next several hours, Elijah slowly recovered, color returning to his face, coherent speech resuming, the immediate danger passing. As Elijah recovered, he began noticing the cabin around him. The warmth was extraordinary, achieved with a fire smaller than what he had been burning unsuccessfully in his own shelter. The air was still and comfortable, with no drafts. The curved walls were free of interior frost. He asked questions, and Nathaniel explained the design principles. Circular shape, minimizing surface area, elimination of corners, preventing cold zones, central heat source, distributing warmth evenly, careful sealing, preventing air infiltration. Elijah stayed with Nathaniel for 2 weeks until the extreme cold broke and he could safely return to his ruined cabin. During that time, he witnessed the round cabin's performance through multiple days of brutal conditions. Elijah Drummond rebuilt his cabin that spring using circular design principles he had learned from Nathaniel. The work took substantially longer than standard construction, and other trappers who visited his site questioned his sanity with the same skepticism Nathaniel had endured. But Elijah had nearly frozen to death in a rectangular cabin and spent 2 weeks surviving comfortably in a round one. The evidence was personal and undeniable. He followed Nathaniel's methods carefully, creating a slightly smaller version that measured 10 feet in diameter, but incorporated the same fundamental principles: circular walls, central fireplace, careful sealing, and conical roof. Word spread slowly through the scattered trapping community during the summer of 1844. Men who visited Nathaniel's or Elijah's cabins saw the unusual construction and heard explanations of thermal efficiency, minimized surface area, and eliminated corners. Most remained skeptical. The designs looked strange, required complex geometry and careful measurement, and demanded far more construction time than traditional methods. For trappers accustomed to building serviceable shelters in less than a week, spending months on a cabin seemed like poor resource allocation. But a few men listened with real interest. These were trappers who had experienced genuinely life-threatening cold, who had burned through firewood supplies trying desperately to stay warm, who had suffered frostbite inside their own cabins. They understood that standard construction had fundamental limitations. When these men heard about circular designs that used 1/3 the firewood, while maintaining superior warmth, they paid attention to substance rather than appearances. A French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Mercier spent 3 days at Nathaniel's cabin in July, asking detailed questions about construction methods. He took notes, made sketches, and measured various elements of the structure. That fall, he built his own circular cabin in territory north of Nathaniel's, adapting the design slightly to use shorter logs and creating an octagonal approximation rather than a true circle. The octagonal design was easier to construct but retained most thermal advantages by eliminating traditional corners and minimizing wall surface area. 2 other trappers built circular or near-circular cabins before the winter of 1844. Neither man achieved the refinement of Nathaniel's original design, but both created structures demonstrably superior to rectangular cabins in thermal performance. The winter of 1844 was moderately cold rather than extreme, so the new designs did not face the brutal test that had validated Nathaniel's cabin the previous year. But even in normal conditions, the improved efficiency was noticeable. Men using circular cabins reported burning significantly less firewood and experiencing more comfortable, stable interior temperatures. The adoption pattern followed typical frontier innovation spread. Early adopters were men who had faced genuine crisis and recognized the need for better solutions. They built carefully, following proven methods closely. Secondary adopters modified the designs based on their own skills and available materials, creating variations that retained core principles while adapting to individual circumstances. The majority of trappers continued using traditional rectangular construction, either because they had not experienced conditions extreme enough to motivate change or because they valued construction speed over thermal performance. Nathaniel made no effort to promote his design or claim credit for the innovation. He had built a round cabin to survive, not to revolutionize frontier architecture. When other trappers asked questions, he answered honestly and shared information freely. He had no interest in fame or recognition, only in staying alive through mountain winters. Nathaniel Kern trapped the Montana mountains for 3 more seasons after building his round cabin, working alone after William's death. The fur trade continued its slow collapse as beaver populations declined and market demand shifted toward other materials. By 1847, even prime pelts brought prices barely worth the effort of harvesting them. Nathaniel recognized the inevitable and made plans to leave the mountains while he still had capital and youth enough to start a different life. He sold his round cabin in the spring of 1848 to a younger trapper named Samuel Greenwood, who paid a premium price specifically because of its superior design. Samuel would live in that cabin for 6 more years, surviving winters that killed or drove out men in lesser shelters. The cabin remained structurally sound throughout that time, requiring only minor maintenance to chinking and roof. When Samuel finally left the territory in 1854, he sold the cabin to another trapper, who occupied it until 1859. Nathaniel moved to Oregon Territory using his accumulated trapping profits to purchase land in the Willamette Valley. He married in 1849 a widow named Catherine Brennan, who had come west with a wagon train and lost her husband to cholera during the journey. They built a farm together, raised wheat and vegetables, and had 3 children over the following years. Nathaniel rarely spoke about his mountain years, treating that period as a separate life that had ended when he left the wilderness. But in the mountains, his innovation continued spreading through organic adoption by men who needed what it offered. By the mid-1850s, circular and octagonal cabins appeared scattered throughout the northern Rockies, wherever trappers, hunters, or prospectors worked in regions with extreme winter conditions. The designs varied considerably. Some builders created true circles using Nathaniel's methods. Others approximated curves with octagonal or hexagonal layouts that were easier to construct, but retained most thermal advantages. A few innovative builders created double-wall circular cabins with insulation between walls, pushing the concept further than Nathaniel had imagined. The broader homesteading movement that followed the Homestead Act of 1862 brought new waves of settlers into mountain territories. Many discovered abandoned circular cabins built years earlier by trappers and recognized their superior construction. Some settlers occupied and maintained these structures. Others studied them and incorporated circular design principles into their own building projects, particularly for structures like root cellars, smokehouses, and storage buildings where thermal stability was valuable. No formal records documented how many circular cabins were built in the decades following Nathaniel's original construction. Frontier building occurred without permits, inspections, or official documentation. Structures appeared, served their purposes, and eventually disappeared as logs rotted, fires destroyed them, or they were simply abandoned. But scattered references in journals, letters, and memoirs from the period mention circular or octagonal cabins in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and parts of Canada, suggesting the design achieved modest but real distribution. Nathaniel died in 1879 at age 68, having lived quietly on his Oregon farm for more than 30 years. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of mountain life or innovative cabin designs, describing him simply as a respected farmer and family man.